The first body was found standing, and that alone was enough to keep most of the village away from the forest, because bodies did not stand after death. Not like that. Not without something holding them in place. And when Ronan Vorn reached the broken fence at the edge of the derevnya, he saw it immediately. A man fixed upright, with his back turned toward the trees, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his head slightly tilted, as if listening to something beyond the tree line. And for a moment, it could have been mistaken for someone alive, someone watching, waiting. But the stillness was wrong, too complete, too absolute, and the crows above circled, without ever landing their wings, cutting slow, uneasy paths through the gray sky, as if whatever held that body there still belonged to something else. Ronan stepped closer, without hesitation, his boots pressing into the damp soil, as his gaze moved across the figure, taking in the details. The clothes torn open along the back, the fabric split cleanly from the neck down, and beneath it the spine exposed, but not as it should have been. Each segment extended outward, sharpened into jagged, uneven edges, like broken blades, forced through flesh and fused into something new, something that did not belong to the body. It had come from the bone, had grown beyond its natural shape, beyond its limits, pushing through muscle and skin, until nothing remained but structure. And that structure now anchored the body into the ground, the lowest segments driven deep into the earth like stakes, holding it upright, in a way no dead thing should be. Ronan did not touch it, because he had seen enough to understand this was not a simple kill, not an animal, not a blade. This was something that changed what it took, something that continued after death, instead of ending with it. And as he straightened, his gaze shifted toward the forest beyond the fence, where the trees stood dense and dark, the light barely reaching the ground beneath them, and the silence. There was not empty. It pressed. Outward, heavy and still, as if something inside had already claimed it. A faint sound reached him, then distant but clear. A sharp cracking noise, dry and sudden, like bone being forced beyond its limit and breaking. And Ronan's hand moved to the hilt of his blade as he stepped past the fence without slowing, moving into the forest where the air changed immediately colder, thicker, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to rot or decay, but something cleaner, something sharper, like freshly broken bone. The ground beneath his boots marked with long, narrow lines cut through the soil. Not footprints, not something that walked, but something that had been dragged repeatedly in the same direction. And he followed them deeper, the cracking sound coming again. Closer now, joined by a low, uneven movement through the undergrowth. And then he saw the second body, this one suspended between two trees, its limbs hanging loose, its head tilted forward, and from its back the same thing had grown outward. The spine extended beyond the body longer than it should have been. The segments sharpened and embedded into the bark of the trees, holding it there, like hooks. And Ronan slowed slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied it more closely. Because this one was different. The growth, less complete. The segments uneven, as if the process had not finished. And that meant whatever caused it was still here, still active, still creating more of them. The forest shifted. Then a faint rustling to his left, followed by another crack, closer now, sharper. And Ronan turned toward it, his gaze fixed on the direction of the sound. As he moved forward more carefully, his steps quieter, his posture lower, because now he knew this was not something he would find already finished. This was something he would meet in the middle of its change, and that made it more dangerous. Not less. The clearing opened ahead just wide enough for light to break through. And he saw movement. There. A figure, crouched low. Its back turned, its body trembling in uneven pulses. And for a moment it looked like a man struggling to rise, struggling to breathe. But then the sound came again, louder this time. A wet, sharp crack, as something forced its way out through the flesh along the spine. Each segment pushing outward one after another, the body jerking with each movement, as if it should have died from the pain alone. And yet it did not. It remained upright, its hands digging into the soil as the growth continued. The bone extending beyond the body, hardening as it emerged, forming jagged edges that caught the light in dull, uneven flashes. And Ronan did not hesitate. He stepped forward, drawing his blade in one clean motion, because this was the moment before it stabilized, before it learned how to use what it had become, and if there was a chance to end it quickly, this was it. But the creature reacted faster than it should have, its body twisting violently as the newly formed spine whipped around, behind it, the segments striking through the air with enough force to force him back a step, as the jagged edges cut past him close enough to tear through the fabric at his chest. And Ronan adjusted instantly, stepping to the side, creating space, because now he understood this was not something that would fall before it adapted. The spine moved with it, not dragging, not slowing, but guiding its balance, its motion as if it had always been part of it. And the creature rose slowly to its full height, the human shape still there, but altered, stretched the skin pulled tight where bone had forced its way through the eyes, wide and unfocused, but not empty. Something still remained behind them, something aware enough to see him, to recognize him as a threat. And the spine shifted again, the segments grinding softly as they locked into a more stable form. And for a moment the creature stood still, as if testing itself, as if learning the limits of what it had become. And Ronan Vorn held his ground, his blade steady in his hand, because he had seen enough to know this was not the end of it. Not a single creature, not a single change. And as the forest behind it shifted once more, faint shapes visible between the trees, other bodies, other forms in different stages of the same transformation, he understood that this was only the beginning, and whatever waited deeper in that forest was not just killing. It was creating something that would not stop on its own. And this hunt would not end with one strike or one body, because the sound of bone breaking came again from somewhere beyond the clearing, and this time it did not stop. The cracking did not stop. After that, it continued somewhere deeper in the forest, uneven and deliberate, as if whatever caused it worked in stages. And Ronan did not advance immediately, because rushing a creature in the middle of change was the fastest way to lose control of the fight. He watched the one in front of him. Instead, the way it held itself, the way the spine shifted behind it, each segment grinding softly against the next as it adjusted its balance, and the delay between movement and correction was small, but real enough to matter. The body was still learning, still aligning with what had forced its way out of it, and that meant it could be broken before it stabilized fully, but not without risk, because even unfinished it had already proven fast enough to cut him. If he misjudged the distance, the creature took a step forward, then not with confidence but with testing intent. its weight shifting unevenly, the spine counterbalancing every motion like a second body that moved just out of sync. And Ronan moved to meet it, but not directly. He angled to the side, forcing it to turn, forcing that delay to widen just enough for him to see how the segments reacted. And when it turned, the spine lagged a fraction of a second before snapping into place. And that was where it was weakest. Not the bone itself, but the connection between what it had been and what it was becoming. The creature lunged, then sudden and sharp, its hands reaching to hold him in place, while the spine followed in a whipping arc aimed to strike through him rather than cut. And Ronan stepped inside the first motion, letting the hands pass him as his blade came up in a short, controlled strike toward the base where the growth began. The steel biting through flesh, but catching on something beneath not bone, not yet but a hardened ridge that resisted more than it should have. And he pulled back immediately, before the spine could reverse its motion, the jagged length slamming into the ground where he had stood with a cracking impact that split the soil and sent fragments of earth outward. And Ronan stepped back, creating space again. Because now he knew enough. The spine was not just an extension. It was being built around something that connected deeper than the surface, and cutting the outer segments would slow it, but not stop it. The creature adjusted again, its movements sharper, now less uncertain, as the segments aligned more cleanly, and that made it more dangerous. With each second he allowed it to remain standing. A low sound came from it. Then not a voice, not anything shaped into words, but something closer to breath, forced through a broken structure, and the eyes fixed on him with more clarity than before, less empty, more focused, and that told him something else. Whatever remained inside, it was not entirely gone. Not yet, and that meant it could still react, not just physically, but with intent. The forest shifted behind it. Then a second figure moving between the trees, slower, more incomplete. Its spine only partially formed, dragging along the ground as it struggled forward, and Ronan's gaze flicked to it, for only a moment, before returning to the one in front of him, because that confirmed the pattern. This was spreading, not a single transformation, but many happening at once, in different stages. And if he did not end it here quickly, the clearing would not remain empty for long. The creature attacked again. This time, more controlled its movement, cleaner. The spine striking first, followed by the body, closing the distance to force him into a position where he would have to choose between blocking or moving, and Ronan chose neither. He stepped forward instead, cutting inside the arc again, his blade driving toward the same point as before, but deeper this time, more precise, and the steel bit further, the resistance giving slightly before stopping again, and the creature reacted instantly, its body twisting violently, the spine snapping down toward him, in a tight, controlled motion that forced him to pull back before it could trap him between the two. And he stepped away, resetting his position, his breathing steady, despite the tightening pace of the fight, because now the change was visible. The delay he had seen before was shrinking, the movements aligning more completely, the creature becoming faster, more stable, more dangerous, and that meant time was no longer on his side. Another crack echoed through the forest behind him, louder than before, followed by a second and a third, each one closer than the last. And Ronan did not turn to look, because he did not need to. He already knew what it meant. More of them were forming more bodies, becoming something like this. And if they reached the same point, at the same time, this would no longer be a hunt. It would be a fight. He could not control the creature in front of him. Shifted again, its posture lowering slightly, its spine lifting behind it into a higher position, the segments locking together in a shape that made its next movement more direct, more precise. And Ronan felt that change immediately. This was no longer a transformation in progress. This was the point where it became something else, something that could act with purpose instead of reaction. And whatever came next would not leave room for hesitation. So he adjusted his grip on the blade, his stance narrowing as he prepared to end it, before the forest filled with more of them, because the next strike would not be a test. It would be the moment that decided whether this thing fell now or became something far worse. The creature moved first, not with the uneven hesitation it had shown before, but with a sudden controlled burst that closed the distance between them in a single step, its hands reaching again, not blindly now, but with intent, aimed to catch and hold, while the spine followed in a tighter arc than before, the jagged segments cutting through the air with a sharper sound. And Ronan reacted instantly, stepping to the side and turning into the motion, his blade coming up to deflect the first strike, just enough to change its path, the edge scraping against hardened bone with a harsh grinding sound, before he slipped past it and drove forward, aiming again for the base where the spine emerged. But this time, the creature anticipated it, its body twisting faster than before, the spine snapping back in a reverse strike that forced him to pull away as the jagged edge tore through the space where his arm had been, and he stepped back, creating distance, because now it was clear the hesitation was gone. Whatever remained of the man inside had given way to something else, something that learned and adapted in real time, and the spine was no longer an unstable growth. It was a weapon fully integrated into its movement. The creature advanced again, pressing him. This time, its strikes overlapping the spine, moving first, followed by the body closing in to force him into narrower space. Each motion calculated to reduce his options, and Ronan gave ground just enough to keep the distance manageable. His eyes fixed not on the outer segments, but on the timing between them. The fraction of a second, where the spine completed its strike and reset, that was still there, still consistent. And that was the opening he needed, but reaching it meant stepping closer than before, closer than was safe. A second shape burst from the trees behind the first. Then its movement less controlled, its spine only half-formed, dragging along the ground as it lunged blindly toward him. And Ronan shifted, immediately cutting it down in a single motion, his blade splitting through the side of its neck and shoulder before it could reach him, the body collapsing with a wet sound. But even as it fell, the partially formed spine twitched against the ground, the segments grinding as if trying to complete the motion it had started. And that alone was enough to make it clear this would not stop with one or two. The forest behind them was still moving, still breaking, still creating more, and the creature in front of him did not hesitate at the distraction it used, it stepping forward with greater speed, its spine striking low, this time aimed at his legs, and Ronan jumped back, just enough to avoid the cut. The jagged bone slicing through the ground where he had stood before, snapping upward again in a second strike that forced him to raise his blade to intercept, and the impact rang through his arm, harder than before. The force behind it, greater, as the segments locked together at the moment of contact, and he twisted his wrist, redirecting it away, before stepping inside the reach again, closing the distance before it could reset fully. And this time, he did not strike. Immediately he drove forward with his shoulder colliding with the creature's chest, forcing it back half a step, disrupting its balance just long enough to bring his blade up from below, in a tight, controlled thrust aimed directly into the connection point, and the steel drove deeper than before, cutting through flesh and into something that resisted differently, something that pulsed faintly beneath the surface, and the creature convulsed violently. In response, the spine lashing out in a wild, uncontrolled arc that forced him to pull the blade free and step back before it could strike him. And the difference was immediate. The movement of the spine less precise. For a fraction of a second, the alignment broken, and that confirmed it. The core was there, not the bone itself, but what drove it, what forced it outward, and held it together, and damaging. It disrupted the whole, but not enough. Not yet. The creature recovered quickly, faster than before, its movement snapping back into place, as if the damage had only slowed it momentarily, and it pressed forward again. More aggressive now, more direct its attacks, losing the measured spacing from before, replaced with rapid, overlapping strikes, meant to overwhelm rather than test. And Ronan moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough for it to trap him. His blade deflecting, redirecting, cutting, only when the opening allowed, because anything less would leave him exposed, and the clearing around them narrowed as he gave ground. The trees closing, in the space tightening, and that made the fight more dangerous because the spine could use those limits against him just as easily as he could use them against it. A third shape moved between the trees, then closer now, more complete, its spine already extended halfway up its back as it stepped into the clearing, drawn by the movement, by the sound. And Ronan felt the shift in the fight immediately, because this was no longer one opponent, this was becoming many, and he could not allow that he changed direction sharply, then stepping toward the first creature, instead of away from it, forcing the distance closed before the second could reach him, his blade moving in a fast, decisive strike across the creature's arm, cutting deep enough to disrupt its balance before driving forward again, his shoulder slamming into it and pushing it back toward the trees, narrowing its space instead of his, and for a moment, the spine struck the trunk behind it, the impact slowing its motion just enough, just long enough for Ronan to see the opening again, the base exposed for a fraction longer than before, and he prepared to take it, because if he did not end this now, the clearing would fill, and there would be no way to control what came next, and the sound of bone cracking came again from the forest behind them, closer, louder. And this time, it did not stop. At one or two, continued in a chain of sharp, breaking sounds that told him exactly what was coming and how little time he had left to stop it, before this hunt turned into something far worse. Ronan did not step back after that, because retreat would only give the others time to reach him, and once they did, this would no longer be a fight he could control. So instead he pressed forward, keeping the first creature between himself and the shapes moving through the trees, forcing them to come through it if they wanted to reach him And that bought him seconds. Nothing more, but seconds were enough if they were used correctly. His eyes fixed on the base of the spine again. Not the outer segments, not the strikes that came from them, but the point where everything connected, the place where the growth began. And the more he watched, the clearer it became. The spine did not move on its own. It responded to something deeper, something that pulsed beneath the surface. And when that pulse faltered, even for a fraction of a second, the alignment broke. The strikes lost precision. The movement lost control. And that was the weakness, not the bone, not the body, but what drove it from within. The creature lunged again, its attacks sharper, now faster. The spine, cutting through the air in tight, controlled arcs, aimed to limit his movement, while the body closed in behind it. And Ronan met it, head on. This time, not avoiding, not circling, but stepping into the strike at the last possible moment. His blade rising to deflect the edge just enough to pass, while his other hand drove forward, catching the creature at the shoulder, forcing its balance off for a fraction of a second. And that was all he needed. His blade thrust forward again, not wide, not forceful, but precise, aimed directly into the same point as before. And this time, he pushed through the resistance, instead of pulling back, the steel cutting deeper into that hidden core. And the creature convulsed violently, the spine lashing out in a wild, uncontrolled motion that tore through the air beside him instead of into him, and he twisted the blade hard before pulling free, stepping back as it staggered. The difference immediate, the movement slower, less precise, the segments grinding against each other, out of sync, and Ronan saw it clearly now. Each strike that reached that core did not just wound it, it disrupted the connection that held the spine together. And if that connection failed completely, the structure would collapse. The creature recovered quickly, though faster than it should have, snapping back into motion with a violent surge forward, as if it understood what he was doing, as if it knew what was at risk. And the attacks came harder, now less controlled but more dangerous. The spine striking in rapid succession, forcing him to move constantly, to deflect, to redirect, to survive, while the second creature reached the edge of the clearing, its movements uneven, but close enough now to matter its spine, dragging behind it, but rising with each step, and Ronan shifted his position again, angling. So the first creature remained between them, using it as a barrier, forcing the second to hesitate to adjust its path. And that gave him another moment, another opening. But this time he did not take it immediately, because he saw something else in the way the spine moved. Now the segments locking tighter before each strike, the connection reinforcing itself. In response to the damage he had done, adapting the same way the creature had adapted to his movement earlier. And that meant he would not get many more chances. Not clean ones. Not like before. He would have to break it completely in a single motion. Or not at all. The forest behind them cracked again, louder, now closer, the sound of more bones breaking, more bodies changing. And Ronan knew he could not let this continue. He shifted his stance lower, his grip tightening on the blade as he stepped forward again, drawing the creature's attention fully onto him, its movements adjusting to match his, its spine lifting higher, preparing for downward strike aimed to end the fight quickly, and Ronan did not avoid it. He stepped into it again, closing the distance before the strike could complete, forcing it to come down at a shorter angle, at a worse position. And as the spine descended, He turned just enough to let it pass his shoulder, the jagged edge tearing through his coat and grazing flesh beneath, but not deep enough to stop him. And in that same motion, he drove forward completely, inside its reach. His blade, coming up from below, aimed directly into the core with everything he had behind it. Because now he understood this was the only way to end it. Not by cutting away at what it had become, but by destroying what made it move, what made it grow, what made it something more than the body it had once been. And as the second creature lunged into the clearing behind him, the distance closing, Ronan Vorn committed fully to the strike, because there would not be another chance. Not with more of them coming, not with the forest still breaking around him. And whatever happened next would decide whether this thing ended here or became something that could not be stopped later. Ronan did not hold back as he drove the blade forward, because anything less than full force would fail. And failure here would not mean retreat. It would mean being torn apart before he could take another step. And the steel struck true, cutting through flesh and into that hidden core, with a resistance that pushed back against him, as if it were alive, as if it understood what he was doing. And he forced it deeper, twisting hard, driving past that resistance, before the connection could close again, and the reaction was immediate. The creature convulsed violently, its entire body locking for a fraction of a second, before the spine erupted into uncontrolled motion, the segments snapping out of alignment, striking wildly in every direction, the controlled precision gone, replaced by raw, unstable force. And Ronan held the blade there for one heartbeat longer, twisting again, until he felt it give not slowly, not partially, but completely. The pulse beneath the surface, breaking the connection, collapsing, and he ripped the blade free, stepping back as the creature staggered its movements, failing all at once, the spine losing structure, the segments grinding against each other out of sync before collapsing downward, the jagged length striking the ground with a dull, heavy crack as the body followed, falling to its knees, then forward into the soil, where it lay still, the unnatural strength that had driven it gone with whatever he had destroyed inside it. And the silence that followed was sharp, immediate, as if the forest itself had paused to see what would happen next. But it did not last. The second creature lunged from behind. Then its movement wild, uncontrolled, its spine only half-formed but still deadly, as it snapped toward him. And Ronan turned to meet it without hesitation, his blade already moving the strike clean and direct, cutting across the base of its neck and into the connection point. Before it could fully close the distance, the steel biting deep enough to disrupt the growth, and the creature collapsed mid-motion, its spine twitching against the ground as it failed to complete what it had begun. And Ronan stepped back again, creating space, his breathing steady, despite the blood that ran down his side, because now he understood the pattern. The core was the same. In all of them, the source of the change, the force that drove the spine outward. And without it, the rest could not hold together, could not move, could not become anything more than what it had been, before the forest cracked again then. But this time the sound was different, not sharp, not active, but breaking, without control, as if something deeper within had faltered, and the chain of transformation had been disrupted. The shapes between the trees stilled the movement, slowing, stopping, as the bodies that had been in the process of change collapsed, where they stood. The growth, halting, mid-formation, leaving. Then broken incomplete, and Ronan watched for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the deeper forest where the sound had come from, because whatever had caused this had not been here, not fully, not in these bodies. It had spread through them, used them, but its source lay further in, and now something there had changed, something had broken, the same way the core had broken here, and that was enough. Not the end, not the full answer, but enough to stop this from continuing. For now, he lowered his blade, slowly turning away from the clearing as the silence settled again. This time without the tension, without the pressure that had filled the forest. Before the air lighter, the scent of fresh bone fading with the passing wind, and as he stepped back toward the edge of the trees, the bodies that had been anchored there stood motionless, no longer shifting, no longer part of anything larger, just what remained after something had been taken and left behind. And Ronan Vorn did not look back as he crossed the broken fence once more, because there was nothing left here to hunt, nothing left that could rise again, not without the force that had driven it. And as he walked away from the forest, the wind carried the last faint sound of bone settling back into place, somewhere deep within the trees. And then even that was gone, leaving only silence behind him, and the knowledge that whatever had started this was still out there, somewhere deeper, waiting to be found before it began again.